Good morning, everybody. What a good start, I'll tell you. I'm just glad to be here, and I'm really glad not to see the sunshine out there. I was a little nervous coming down here yesterday. It's in the 70s and sunny. I didn't know what that would do to our attendance, but it's pretty nice to see what we have. And I know there's a big itch to get open, at least up in New England Friday. You guys are already open. A lot of places in New England, it's Friday's the big day. Everybody's kind of nervous about it. My feeling was, oh, don't worry about it. You said Friday to be your opening day. You know what's going to happen Friday. It's the end of the good weather. So maybe that'll kind of calm things down. So anyway, we've had quite a year. 2011 was the year of extremes. It's been mentioned several times this morning for sure. And with that extreme weather, we had a number of disasters. And disasters come in many forms. All right, there's the natural disasters, things that we really can't do that much about. And as Dave said earlier, you know, throughout the region, we do have a pretty large and diverse region. You're going to find somebody is going to experience a disaster, whether it's a natural disaster or self-inflicted. But last year, it was just crazy. In this area, probably more than any other, just seemed to have a bullseye going. And with the extreme tropical storms and wet weather that we had, a lot of golf courses, a lot of you in this room suffered, and people that did. So what do we experience typically between hurricanes? Last year we had a major tornado, microbursts, tons of windstorms, just damage, just cleanup, a lot of cleanup, which really doesn't have anything to do with natural disasters. But flash floods, in addition to some of those thunderstorms, and definitely the tropical storm and the hurricane that came up the coast. Then we had October, the snowstorm that really wiped out a lot of golf courses and some of the tree plantings. But, it was more so just power losses and things like that, hail and others. Some of the man-made problems that we've had are, based on some of the agronomic decisions. These are things we have more control of, and these are some of the things that we'll look at probably in a little bit more depth as far as what we can do to prevent disasters in the future. So let's review some of those 2011 disasters, shall we? I like to show some pictures and bring back some pretty ugly memories for some, but I'll tell you, it just shows you how resilient our group is, our industry and our group is, because we went through a lot last year, there's no doubt about it. And some courses were extremely damaged and had to close shop up in September of last year, and hopefully to open this spring. But it was just wild. Coastal damage was big. Spring started out with such a snowpack up north, and really the flooding started up there and to an extent down through western New England and down into the Med area. But really northern Vermont, upstate New York, Canada, Quebec. This happens to be the Richelieu River in Quebec. And as bad as the flooding is on golf courses, and all these other storms, you have to keep in mind, the real problems are the damage outside of our properties, the golf courses, the personal damage that occurs to homes and to people's lives. But needless having to say that, it really did set things back for sure. And with that damage, it's a loss of revenue. Can't use the golf course. And at a time when we really can't afford to lose revenues, last year was pretty hard in the pocketbook for a lot of properties, for a lot of golf courses. So tough spring. Then let's look at some of the hurricanes and that storm surge. And I mentioned earlier, I'm jumping around last year a little bit, but this happened to be Fisher's Island. And they took both pretty hard, and the storm surge was significant. There are a lot of other coastal courses that suffered saltwater flooding, not to mention the debris and wash-up. This is a little shot Don Beck sent me from Fisher's. Kind of just, I have a series of these, but I'll just show you two. This was looking down, I think, at the 13th or 14th hole, and as the storm surge came up, now this is all salt water. That's pretty much what was inundated on the 13th and 14th holes, one giant salt pond. So with that, there was a ton of damage, a ton of cleanup, and a lot of problems. There were some hailstorms, thank God, not so much in our region, but you can see how devastating a severe hailstorm is when you're faced with something like that. I call that a disaster. We have the Massachusetts tornado. I'll tell you a little bit of a funny story about that in a little bit, but actually, tornadoes, I know we've had them down here in the Med area, we've had them all over, but the severity of this one was an eye-opener because it went right through, right through West Springfield and Springfield. And the property damage was, again, was immense. This happened to be Veterans Municipal Golf Course. It's a Springfield city course. Extreme damage. It hit them in June, early June, and the golf course, 9 holes, they closed the whole place, but 9 holes were devastated for cleanup wise, not the course so much, but just because of all the tree damage, which was a good thing. But it closed the course for over a month. So we lost 5 weeks of revenue for the city of Springfield. That's a big deal. That's a disaster to that city who's struggling. There's just the track of the tornado you can see on Google Earth. It ran about 50 miles, and if you ever get an opportunity, if you're up in Massachusetts, you're on the Mass Pike, you want to see what a tornado can do, get off at the Palmer exit and drive to Sturbridge, or Sturbridge to Palmer. It's a 10-15 mile stretch. You'll drive right through it. It'll blow you away. You'll gain an absolute new respect for the devastation of a tornado. And again, nothing like what happened in Alabama and the southeast, but wow, it leaves a lasting mark. The flash floods and all that, I'm just going to continue on. Again, it was a big deal in the end of summer when we had the hurricane and the tropical storm come up. And I know 80+ inches of rain in some parts of the Hudson Valley and Med area, Susquehanna Valley up in Binghamton, central New York. But you move up into Vermont, and it just seemed the flash flood damage that they had up in that Quechee Valley, western Massachusetts, right on up into Quebec, was crazy. These are some shots from Quechee, and this is the river that runs through the golf course, and you can see the scale of that water and the trees that were just knocked up against that bridge. This was a culvert up in Jay Peak that absolutely got crushed by the weight of the water. Not a small culvert. Flattened out like an aluminum can. Incredible. It got washed downstream about 55, 60 feet. They had to go and cut it up and get it out of there when time was available. Another shot of Vermont course. This is Quechee. Again, river deposited just a little bit of debris on one of the holes. A little bit larger debris. Here you got your gravel mine. Blows out bunkers. There's some of the silt and debris that was on some of the fairways. And it just doesn't end. Stockbridge, same thing. Cleaned up from the first storm that came through. They got most of the greens cleaned up and the water off. And no kidding, within 24 hours, the next one came through. And they just closed up shop, said, we're done. We can't do anything. We'll see you next year. Play somewhere else. It's out of our hands. So, very devastating. Another shot at Quechee. We've had droughts. Winter injury, just another example of a disaster. Last year with this area, this part of the country, it was your lucky year. It seemed like the Med area and some of the coastal areas of New York got hit with winter injury. Well, that's a natural disaster. It's a weather-induced disaster. It kills grass. When it's real bad, it can really shut down your golf course or make it fairly unplayable for 6-8 weeks in some cases. And the greens really take some time to come back. So another example of what we were up against last year, maybe not to the same degree as we've seen in other years, but if you've got it, it's a disaster. And it's one of those things, in many cases, it's out of your hands, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it. Here's a man-made $250,000 disaster. Irrigation tech recharged the irrigation system before it was ready to be recharged. A little miscommunication blew out the bank of this coastal property. They weren't so worried about the tee, they were worried about the rest of the bank and disappearing on them, so it was quite a renovation project to get that reestablished. So sometimes they're man-made problems, but typically they are weather-induced. It might be an agronomic decision that goes bad. It could be a chemical application. Maybe it's a misapplication. Maybe it's a tainted chemical. Or perhaps it's a new product that really isn't thoroughly tested. And we had that several years ago in the heat. You go out with products that seem to work. You base your use maybe on testimonials or limited use on your own property. You get a different type of weather circumstance, more stressful turf, and you could have a problem. Certainly unintentional. Sometimes they're deferred maintenance. Just not doing the proper cultural practices over years. You get away with it in a good weather year, but ultimately it catches up to you. And usually, again, it coincides with a bad weather event. And maybe not such a large scale problem, but a disaster is relative. If you lose a portion of a green or several greens or 1 or 2 greens, that can be disastrous. Certainly disastrous to your career. So these are some of the things that you have to look at. Poor construction and design. This is pretty extreme poor construction. This was a putting green attempt up in Maine at a small course I visit, and it was pretty ugly. We couldn't even pull samples out because the rock was so bad. But doomed for failure. I mean, it was just set up to be a disaster. You've got 9 greens built to this spec, so-called. It'd been better not to rebuild the darn greens because it was an absolute mess. And same thing with this situation. This was due to the flash flood event up in northern Vermont again, but they've got 65 bunkers that were not built properly. Now, sure, they would all wash in that kind of a storm, but the fact that the liner's washed and all the gravel, and I mean, it's a complete rebuild. There's no resurrecting these bunkers. So maybe it's a positive out of a negative. This is one of those situations where they're able to do something long-term and improve the condition of it. But even vandalism is a disaster, and it can be, and it's another just example of a man-made problem. So, again, the problems with disasters, what we're looking at, we're going to lose the golf course. You're going to have unhappy members for sure. Lost revenues, you might have damage to infrastructure, things like that that you have to deal with. The other thing we often overlook when you do lose a lot of turf, and I see this time and time again with courses that flood annually, maybe several times a year they flood, excuse me, or with winter kill scenario, it is really tough on the crew. It just exhausts people. Your staff is dragging by early summer in many cases with the whole season ahead. And it can be, it's a real difficult thing. Nobody wants to go through. We want to avoid it, obviously. And so what are the steps that you can do? Are there any steps you can do? No golf course is disaster proof, that's for sure. But I would say that, yeah, most of the time there are things that we should do. Most of us are doing in this room, and I just kind of want to maybe raise some points, get people thinking a little bit, but again, most of this you probably are addressing in one form or another. But, what action can you take to reduce or avoid disastrous situations? How you deal with that disaster or with that major turf loss is almost as important or more important than whether it can be avoided or not. You have to assume that eventually something's going to happen. You're going to be up against this situation. So how you deal with that, how you run through that operation, it can really make or break you and make you look, show off your professionalism or not. And it's an opportunity in many cases to get projects done. Use these bad occurrences to make some positive change on the golf course. There's no reason to dwell on it. Even if it's a man-made, self-induced problem, well, you learn from that problem, but let's correct the situation, and maybe we can make a marginal green site or whatever the structure is on the golf course, improve it and make it better for the members. So then the problem is forgotten, hopefully. And that's what we're going to take a look at. So how do you do that? Well, I think you want to evaluate your infrastructure, identify some of the vulnerable areas, some of the scenarios that you might be up against, problems that you can foresee, develop corrective plan of action. Take action. At least identify those areas and have a plan of action available. Whether it ever gets implemented, hopefully that's what you're striving for, but at least go to that route. Now you say, okay, that's great, but my golf course is in a floodplain. There's no way, we flood. That's what we do. We accept that. Well, that's true, you do. But I can tell you from just talking with people at Stockbridge, they can flood once a year. They flooded 3 times last year. What Bruce Packer, the superintendent, told me is, most of our floods are spring related, out of snow melt and what have you. Sometimes they'll flood during season. He said, the spring floods aren't bad to the golfers, to the members, because we have a summer membership. We clean everything up and we're good to go by summer. So to them, it's just it's too bad, inconvenience for the staff. Well, this year, they flooded 3 times, twice in their prime season. Well, guess what? I think some action is going to be taken. They've got 4 or 5 greens that they want to elevate. Yeah, the golf course will flood, but at least let's get the greens above. Maybe we can relocate the pro shop to a higher elevation. Maybe we can do something with the tennis court so we don't go through that constant loss and damage, property damage, and knock our insurance rates down a little bit. So these are things that you might be able to do. These are bigger, more expensive projects, a lot of permitting, and in some cases there might be things that you really can't do. You're going to be at the mercy of a catastrophic weather event. You can't avoid a tornado, you can't avoid a hurricane, but let's try to get the golf course in a condition that at least it can stand up to that and reduce the scope of damage and the time that the golf course is disrupted. The easier ones to deal with are the man-made or self-induced ones, and here's where you really want to take a look at some of the things you're doing, reevaluate your maintenance objectives, and based on some of that, what cultural practices are you doing that can be changed, or what needs to be implemented that you're not doing to create conditions that will make that golf course, your playing surfaces much more resilient, can tolerate bad weather conditions, and things like that. So taking corrective action to improve the infrastructure. Identify some of the problems with the infrastructure, whether it's irrigation or whether it's a growing environment issue, most likely some kind of a drainage issue, which Dennis will talk about a little bit later. Key, critical part of it. If you can address those areas, hopefully you're going to have fewer problems and much less downtime, much less impact from a particular disaster. So get out there and take a look at what's going on. We all do. Sometimes you need some outside help to do that. And that's where the Turf Advisory Service can be very helpful. Not only identify, but help communicate some of those problems to green committees or to boards and so forth. It can just be one more helpful piece of information to get something done. Sometimes you got to get dirty and dig some holes. Find out why the greens aren't draining. It's ugly. It's not pretty sometimes, but you have to get out and get dirty, and that's not the problem. But a little disruptive to figure out what's going on. Don't be afraid of some physical testing. Get a lot of outside help that way, especially physical soil testing. It might be some nutrient testing, water tests, things like that. But build a case. Start looking at it. It might be an irrigation audit. It might be shade analysis. Yeah, we can monitor shade patterns on greens, and we should do that. But in some cases, you need an ArborCom or maybe a Sunseeker application. Can really be helpful, and sometimes a little bit better communication tool to golfers and to members that really are anti-tree removal. They don't want to see a tree taken out. And this can be very convincing evidence for them that yes, we need to do something to get conditions a little bit stronger. No better way to do it though than with pictures. This is a course up in Massachusetts that has pretty severe winter kill problems. Well, they have these huge Norway spruce trees. Take a picture of the shade pattern and take a picture of the ice. Let them know. Better yet, if it's dead grass in the spring, take a picture of the dead grass in the shade pattern, and hopefully you'll get the leverage to take the trees out. But use different tools. I mean, just show the weather extremes. Maybe it's a bad growing environment. Get a temperature sensor, humidity, the temperature, humidity, and wind sensor, and give you some heat index information. Compare it to areas that are in more open growing environments. Avoid disastrous situations when the weather gets tough in those areas. Also, since we're on trees, I just want to mention tree maintenance. Not only, Adam mentioned it as far as the maintenance standards, how important tree maintenance is. Well, it really is important because if you constantly on tree maintenance, number one, you want to identify good trees and bad trees. But if you're pruning and constantly taking out the weaker species, the dead wood in the trees, making the canopies, better branch structure, healthier plants, they're going to be able to withstand some of the heavier wind conditions or some of the freak snowstorms that we get from time to time. You significantly reduce some of the tree damage that you would get on your golf course. Get out there in the rain and check the drainage patterns. When we get the big downbursts, the 2-inch rainstorms, and you're going to get water moving across the property, look at the drainage patterns. It's a great way to know where water wants to go on the golf course. You can't fight it. Look for collar dams, areas that block the water on putting greens. You know what's going to happen in this situation. You've got one area of surface drainage predominantly, and maybe it works in the summertime, but what's going to happen in the wintertime? That's going to be your area where your ice accumulations are, and you're going to be more apt to lose grass in those areas. So do something with surface drainage. It might just be modifying the grade of the green top, knocking down collar dams, lowering the grade of your collar so the water flows off, as Dave mentioned, and make a big difference. But it's a great selling tool. Problems can be obvious, old Galvy, but sometimes you need a good prop. And there's nothing better than sitting at the board table and putting out that rusty old irrigation pipe or that clay ball that you made from your tee boxes that you can make tee markers out and just rolling it across the table. That's when I'm growing grass on. Maybe not so much avoiding a disastrous situation on a large scale, but it helps. I mean, these are all small things you want to avoid some turf loss or some problems when weather conditions get tough in the future. Maybe an in-house irrigation audit. Again, prove what's going on, or have an irrigation consultant come in and do the audit for you. It's not big money. If you're having problems with an irrigation system, your coverage isn't quite right, it's not, you're just not happy with it, you know that the system's old, or you have maybe even a new system, you just need to get it evaluated and tweak it, that's a good way to go. In this case, this is a problem of a pretty good foreshadowing of problems to come. This was saltwater intrusion on a coastal golf course. At this point, the saltiness of the water wasn't enough to kill the bentgrass or even the POA. I think it started to stress the POA a bit, but boy, I'll tell you, some of the annual plants and trees around the golf greens and around the clubhouse were damaged early. It's a pretty good indication there's some issues with the irrigation water. Now that could be a disaster. And frankly, it did not help things. They still lost grass. But it gives you an idea and it starts allowing you to, okay, what do I do? How do I mitigate that salt water in my irrigation? What do I irrigate with? What are my contingency plans? What can I do? Sometimes the problem might not be the golf course itself. And I think it was brought up very well today with Adam and the maintenance standards. It might be just the expectation levels aren't realistic for your golf course, for the infrastructure, for your resources that you have available to maintain the golf course. How is that a disaster? Well, you get lucky. You can provide probably these unrealistic conditions in certain years when things are fairly normal, benign, but when the weather turns bad like it did in 2011, or 2010 especially with real long heat, you can't sustain those programs. So, you know, this is part committee superintendents. We all identify these problems, but it's important to communicate these problems to the general membership, and the Green Committee has a real big role, as big as the superintendent in this regard. So, real important thing to look at. So you identify the problems, but you also need to take action. And, you know, voice these concerns. You don't want to whine. You don't want to sound like the sky is falling. But you have to identify potential scenarios, potential problems that could occur on your property. If you're not doing that, then you're not doing your job. I mean, you're trying to protect the golf course, you're trying to protect the membership, and as a superintendent and a Green Committee, and we all do this, but you know, document, make sure you're in front of it and going with it, and cooperate to get this thing done. So it's a possibility. Managing through a disaster is an opportunity to show how professional you are, how good your programs are, or not. And it depends on how you handle it and how you look through the process. I say these disasters are going to hit you one time or another in your career, and they're not going to be avoidable. So how you deal with it can make or break you. Here's just a neat little story. This is a small little golf course up in western Massachusetts in the Berkshires. They lose grass a lot. Not recently, but when I moved up there, they lost grass with winter kill probably every 3 years. And the story was that, well, they had a good membership, blue-collar membership, loved the place, they played it a lot. They said, well, we know we can't really prevent winter kill. It happens here. And so we've got POA, we've been told that, bad greens, whatever. We live with the winter kill, that's what happens. So they never evaluated the superintendent on the winter kill. They just evaluated him on how well he got the greens back, how fast he got it back. Now, it's probably not a reputation you all want, right? How good you are getting grass back. But to this day, he's there and doing a hell of a job. And actually, they've come up with a few precautionary things to stop the winter kill, so it's helped them out. Some proactive steps, too, make you look good. Dave mentioned putting green nurseries as insurance. Absolutely. And if your nursery's not large enough, if it's not in good shape, if it's been neglected, if it's too thatchy and it's really not suitable for use on putting greens, it's not going to do you any good during a disaster. So that's something to look at. Do you have contingency plans if you don't have a good nursery? You think you might have good relations with sod growers or sod brokers? Well, you better make sure you do and be on the phone quick and have sources lined up, because everybody else is probably going to be in the same boat looking for that same sod. Same thing with generators. You lose power. Something happens in the summer and you don't have any ability to operate your irrigation system. Well, there's a disaster waiting to happen. Do you have a portable generator? Again, do you have sources where you can bring a temporary situation and maybe bring a generator in, or some kind of a temporary pump that you can operate your system on? A big deal with saltwater flooding. I mean, if you've got to leach salt because you're a coastal course, you got to have the ability to get the water back on, which was a problem with some golf courses this fall who haven't been through it. So these are just some of the things that you have to think about during the event when you're going through a disaster struck. Some of the things you want to look at. Obviously, communication is always a big deal, not only to your members and to your Green Committee, but also to your staff and what kind of plan of action you're going to take. Be upfront, no time to hide, and cover your head. If a mistake was made, be honest about it, and let's go forward and make the best of it and try to make something positive out of it. Think before taking action. Be calm. In some cases, you can hurt yourself. You react, and maybe what you do has a more negative effect than if you did nothing at all. And sometimes it's just human nature. You want to do something, or it might be better just to sit back for half a day, talk to a few people, talk to your assistants, run some ideas. Is that rational? Are we jeopardizing the turf further by doing this? Is this really a good means of cleanup? I mean, there's an awful lot going on, an awful lot on your plate at that point, but those are things you might want to look at. And then Dave made a good point last week. Maintain a good detailed journal of events, and I say take a lot of pictures. We had a couple presentations up at the New England show about a month ago that were just fabulous on Quechee and Stockbridge with the flooding and so forth. Well, fabulous to us. We got to see the dirty work, but the pictures were great, so it really helps educate other people. And then finally, if something bad happens to you, you got to make something positive out of it. If not, you go crazy. It might not be a huge deal, but anything will make the golfers happy, make you happy, make your staff happy. It might be even getting a cultivation practice in place that otherwise people were just against, or the timing wasn't right. Now we can't do that till November. We can't aerify till, or we can't do this or that. Well, sometimes you have some problems, you have some turf loss. Boy, those things change in a hurry. Why didn't you aerify in September? What's the problem? Well, we'll do it from now on, believe me. It's going to be done. So sometimes it helps to implement programs. Upgrade infrastructure. Regrassing greens. It might be a bad irrigation system. It might finally be the big drainage program on some of the bad fairways. I mean, these are ways that you lose grass or you have a catastrophic event. These programs all of a sudden take top shelf over the bunker renovation program or sorry, Dave, the practice facilities. There's prioritized to the golf course, so it's good. And quite often these things get initiated more quickly. Here's just a couple of ones to finish off on. This was leverage. This happened about 18 years ago at Salem Country Club. I've used this picture before in Winterkill talks, but here's a situation, your 18th green at Salem. I could not get them to take down the bloody white pine trees on the right side of that green no matter what I did. Well, he had some bad winter kill, and I happened to be there early when they were trying to bring the greens back from the winter kill. I took a shot and I said, isn't it unique how every shade pattern is dead on your putting green and your approach areas? So yeah, you think it's the trees? Yeah. Trees were gone within weeks. And that's what I mean. It's a bad thing that happened, but something that positively improved that golf course. Since the trees were down, they really haven't had any problems with those putting greens anymore. So it's a big deal. Another scenario, this was a course that regrassed greens, and regrassing is sort of obviously one infrastructure improvement that we can see if it's done properly. In this case, they're dealing with Poania. They had a pretty bad soil condition below. They had a huge tree issue, and they lost POA and even some bed grass on those greens for probably 2 or 3 or 4 years. Memberships down, and they were very sour, sullen membership. And really, the regrassing option was a good way to do it. And everybody was upset and mad about it, but once they realized this might be a way to go forward to take care of some of the agronomic problems that they had, to get the leverage, to cut the trees down, it's made a big difference. And that's probably going to become more and more common throughout the Northeast when expectation levels remain as high as they do, and it's just a positive way to go about taking care of this. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. We are running a little bit late, but I can take a question or two if there are any, I guess, and then we'll go right into our break. Any questions? All right. Well, hey, thank you very much.